So Ajahn, welcome to the Dhamma stream for the Vassa 2023. So brothers and sisters in the Dhamma, we're very happy to have Ajahn Asoko to join us from Amaravati, who shared with us his pearls of wisdom. But before we begin, can we put our palms in Anjali and welcome Ajahn here by paying respects to him, by offering him 3 bows. First bow, please. Second bow. Third bow. Very delighted to have you here, Ajahn. May we please invite you to lead us in a short meditation.
Okay. So just greetings to everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. So we can just sit for 20 minutes, just allow the mind to rest a little bit, connect ourselves. So using these periods we take to sit meditation, as we say, that's what we call it. It's really just taking a moment to reconnect with here and now. Or we're not trying to do anything special, we're not trying to get anything, to get rid of anything. We're really just, as Lumpur Sumedho likes to describe, just coming back and being the witness to the way it is here and now. So tune in to the body. What is the body like here and now? What does it feel like? Is it comfortable or not? Is it tensed or relaxed? And just take a moment to notice what the body feels like. Notice what the state the mind is in. And it's the morning or the afternoon or the evening, and just to notice what it feels like right now. Does it feel awake? Does it feel relaxed? Does it feel sleepy? Lazy? Is it bright? Is it quiet and centered? Or does it feel busy and restless? So it doesn't really matter what it feels like, but to notice it's like this right now. Whatever the body feels like, whatever the state of the mind is, it's okay. We can just let it be what it is. We don't need to change it. We don't need to judge it. We can just let it be. And this allows us to relax. It's easier to be the witness to the present moment if we're relaxed. So I encourage you to do that, to relax here and now, whatever the conditions are. And just take a moment to settle, noticing the body, noticing the mind. where it is at, what it is doing. Noticing the breathing. So we sit here and just watch. Notice how the habit tendencies are such that we tend to go back out to thoughts and memories, drift off with moods. And be the witness to that. So coming back to the position of the witness doesn't mean we're trying to get rid of anything that arises. But we're establishing ourselves, so to speak, in this position of knowing. Noticing the arising, the change, and the ceasing. Using the here and now as our anchor.
brothers and sisters. Let us now request a Dhamma Talk from Ajahn Asoko. Brahman Chaloka Dipati Sahambati Katan Jari'an Diwara Ayachata Santi Dhasata Paraja Kajatika Dese Dhamma Anuga Imang Pajang.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So reflecting on the way it is. It's good when we do sit for a moment and practice to just review. It's one of the 4 factors that compose what we call the path to success, or the Iddhipadas in Pali, is the ability to review the efforts that we just put into a certain endeavor, and then review the results, so that we can learn something from our attempts on the path, with the practice. Just looking at these 20 minutes we sat together, noticing what it was like, and noticing the thinking that keeps arising and ceasing during the process, and also the thinking that happens right after. That was a good sit, or that wasn't a good sit. All these thoughts that arise. Because really this experience of the world, of life, what we're experiencing every waking moment, is a pretty sticky web of things arising and ceasing. And just sitting for 20 minutes, we can notice it reveals the tendencies in the mind to just chase after whatever arises, sounds that we hear, and we send the mind out. Memories that arise, thoughts, feelings in the body, moods, and how strong the tendency is to follow these things. It's so easy to get caught up in our reactions to what arises here and now. So much so that we forget there is a here and now, and we just chase after what arose, and we're gone. So these periods of sitting that we put aside and make use of, it's good to use the ability to investigate what's happening. If it's peaceful and we end up feeling quite centered and quiet and peaceful, it's very good. But that is also something that we can get lost in. It's the pleasure of tranquility and silence, which is good. And it is to be cultivated. And yet it is also something we can just drift off into, get attached to. So if we're going to use these opportunities for practice to reconnect with here and now and cultivate this witness position, this knowing, like Lompo Sumedho is always encouraging us to trust awareness. And so this position of awareness, of knowing, of witnessing that we come back to, it always implies that we're coming back to a position from which we are witnessing sankharas, we're witnessing conditions arise and cease. And so in the practice, when we sit as we just did, we use that opportunity to witness for a little while here and now. And then when the period of practice is over and the bell has rung and we move on to the next thing, it's good to try to not just chase after the next thing and run after that. Like, okay, meditation's done, move on. So we bring the practice with us. Oh, okay, now the meditation's ended. And just notice what that's like. It's a way of bringing the practice with us so that it's with us when we're sitting. And then we get up and do some walking meditation. We bring the practice with us. The witness is always here and now. So how do we connect with that? And then when we're not doing formal practice, when we're going about our daily duties, activities, chores, work, we socialize, we go shopping, cook and eat and do the dishes, clean the household, all these things that we have to do when we have a body and a mind to take care of. And just to notice, we can use that for practice as well, and just keep reminding ourselves in terms of witnessing, of knowing what's happening right now. Ask yourself questions, because they're a very, very good way of opening the mind. The question usually opens up. And then we're not operating from someone who already knows, oh, this is the body, yeah, the mind, things arise and cease. And we can kind of do that to ourselves, kind of just throw Dhamma lines at ourselves in the mind. If we ask questions, then we avoid that, and we're really coming back to looking, investigating. That's what detectives do. They ask questions when they're trying to find out the truth about some sordid situation. They ask questions. So asking questions opens up to this, leads us to this looking. What's happening? What is there here and now? What's the body like? What does it feel like? What's the mood in the mind? Is the mind quiet and still, or is it thinking and remembering? And then when we notice things arising and ceasing in terms of body and mind and this whole realm of experience, we'll ask ourselves, what is the witnessing position here? What is the knowing? And it's a position, knowing and witnessing Listening is a position of silence and stillness within this realm of movement. So we find ourselves really in this flow of conditions that are changing all the time, which is what our experience is made of. And paradoxically, these things are moving all the time, changing, rising, and ceasing. But if we don't develop the ability to come back to witnessing change, witnessing arising and ceasing from this position of knowing, which is a position of awakened silence and stillness, it's bright. Well, then we get caught up in these things and we lose our freedom because we get caught up in the flow of what's arising and ceasing. And what we're developing is, as much as this getting to know this position of witnessing, of wise presence, is the ability to come back to it. So recognizing it, and then when the mind does drift off or gets caught up in the flow of things, when we realize that, to come back to this witnessing. So it's a type of inner mobility that is a characteristic of freedom. Notice things arising and ceasing as they're moving through us, as moods move through us, as likes and dislikes arise, as reactions to whatever's happening in the present moment. We see people doing some certain things, whether it's in real life around us or whether you're watching the news and reacting to what you read in the papers, see on TV. Things people say, the way they say it, the tone, all of these things, they're all stimulating us. And very often causing reactions, giving rise to assumptions, preferences, likes, dislikes. And very often we do move after these things because that is the habit in the mind, is to follow likes and dislikes, to go after what we find pleasant, to try to get rid of what we dislike and find uncomfortable, painful, or suffering, whether it's in the material world or just in the realm of our moods, interacting with each other. We react. Even being by ourselves, when we sit by ourselves in a room, memories and thoughts arise, and moods, and we react to those. We hope, we worry, we fear. So it's important to recognize how normal these things are. And that's what the first noble truth, that the way the Buddha tells us there is suffering, is really basically just telling us there is all of this stuff. It's what samsara is made of. Nothing that arises and ceases is not normal. There is no such thing. That's the norm in samsara. Stuff arises and ceases, and some of it is ordinary, some of it is crazy, but it all belongs. And so our ability to recognize how life affects us, notice the reactions, and notice how it tends to move us. When we react to something, when we grasp something that moves because it arises and ceases, and if we grasp hold of it as it arises and ceases, we have to move with it. And then the ability to recognize that and let go, open the hand that grasps, let it do what it does, let it go. We do that from this position of informed, wise, understanding, witnessing. And in a way, when we let go of something like that, we're just coming back to here and now. We renounce chasing after something. It brings us back to this stillness, this open, relaxed, conscious stillness. So I like to think about it as practice more often than as meditation, because as I got to know Buddhism and got to study Dhamma, listen to teachings, to Dhamma instructions, I found that meditation very easily became something I had to do, and that meant sitting still, quiet, bright and wise. And that's not always what happens. But in terms of practice, practice doesn't assume a certain situation or a certain result. Practice is more about coming back to this position of the witness, and then what am I a witness to? What is happening here and now? And it's literally practicing, recognizing, learning to recognize the present situation in terms of Dhamma, in terms of what it is, here and now. And that understanding automatically lands us back at this position of here, now, witnessing. And then we are the silence, we are the stillness that is witnessing the noise and the movement of sankharas. So the practice means we do get caught up in stuff, we do chase after stuff, we get caught up in moods, we believe assumptions, we make mistakes, we get caught up in lines of thinking about the future. We do get caught up in thinking about the past and then reacting to both. Whether it's the future or the past, these things arise and then we react to them. We feel certain ways about them. Those feelings give rise to more thoughts, more moods, more feelings and likes and dislikes, emotions. And we're back into this sticky business of samsara. And so the practice is just to recognize that that is normal. That is what every single practitioner is dealing with. So the practice is, how do I recognize this? How do I recognize here and now in terms of Dhamma? And how does that understanding in terms of Dhamma automatically bring us back to this position of witnessing, of stillness, and recognizing that, recognizing awareness, knowing, recognizing this consciousness that Lompo keeps talking about. And then when we recognize it and we recognize its value, then we can learn to trust it. Learning to trust awareness can be a bit of a a bit of a puzzle at the beginning when we are not accustomed to paying attention to that part of our experience that is conscious and aware. We're so accustomed to chasing after thoughts. And generally speaking, we're an educated society, and so we learn how to think. But in our curriculum, in our processes of education, we don't usually think how to put down the thinking. We don't learn how to do that. We don't have classes in the morning about thinking and then classes in the afternoon about putting down thinking. That's not how the system is designed. And yet, it would be very beneficial if it was, because we suffer from too much thinking. We suffer from what happens when we think a lot and we believe our thinking, and we don't recognize what the nature of thinking is. In school, we're taught that we can use thinking, develop critical thinking, backed up all this information, and then they ask us to pass exams and they rate us on the quality of our thinking. So we're encouraged and rewarded for thinking. Which is the way it works, but then we don't learn how to be careful of thinking. We get deluded and identify with this ability to think. But thinking is really just something that's created in the mind, and it's really important to recognize that. Because that same thing that produces this thinking then produces the thought that I am the thinker. And we can thank Descartes for leaning into that as well. I think, therefore I am. And that might be truer than he may have imagined when he said that or wrote that, because it is out of thinking that we create this sense of I. But these thoughts are not self. Thoughts are a conditioned process. It's very interesting living in a community of monks, because the Dhamma attracts all kinds of people, and what we have in common, whether we're ordained or not ordained lay people, whether we live in the monastery permanently or just visiting, what brings us all together is this awareness of suffering and the faith that the Buddha's teaching is pointing to a way out of suffering. That's what we have in common. And then it brings together people from all walks of life. Where I ordained in Thailand, in Wat Pah Nanachat, is a very diverse and multicultural, multi-linguistic, multinational community. Even here in England, I'm not quite sure. I don't think the English are in the majority here. I think they're a minority in the monastery. And it's really interesting to notice that, because it really makes very obvious how culture is a conditioning. Language conditions thinking, how education conditions thinking. Not everybody who comes to the monastery is from a similar educational background. We don't all come out of universities or high school or just finished primary school and at 16 years old we stopped. We're not all from similar backgrounds. And so we don't look at things the same way. We don't understand a similar situation that we can experience together makes us feel differently. We experience it differently. We can't very often even imagine what somebody else is feeling in a certain situation. We can assume, but those assumptions are coming from our perspective. They're informed by the conditioning we have been exposed to. And there's no right or wrong. There's no one way of looking at it is better than another. But what we can recognize, whatever our cultural background is, whatever our family conditioning is, whatever our childhood has been, what the practice is about, and the place where we find freedom from the suffering that arises, is in our ability to recognize not just what's happening in terms of events that we're experiencing here and now, but how it makes us feel. So the feelings that arise, the thinking, the thoughts that arise, the memories that are raked up by certain events, and the emotions. And our ability to recognize that, our ability to just stop, come back to this position of the witness and realize, it's like this. It feels like this. It seems like this. This is the reaction that arises in this situation. And the reaction means not just the emotional, but the thinking patterns that arise. And it's really, really a treasure to be able to have perspective on thinking, because it gives us freedom from a path that would lead to a lot of suffering, and often does. If we believe the thoughts, if we believe the assumptions we make, then we're going to follow those. We're not free from them. And when you start paying attention to assumptions that arise in the mind, it is very humbling to realize how the vast majority of them are completely off the mark. They do not have anything to do with reality, and the assumptions we make about other people especially are usually completely wrong. So developing the ability to witness thinking is a real treasure. Of course, this can happen as in the course of usually meditation, but not necessarily. We do experience moments of silence when the mind does go quiet. And that provides us with a very valuable insight, because when things are quiet, then we're realizing what thinking is. When things go quiet, thoughts, the thinking process has just ceased. And then we're aware of the silence. And then the next thought arises, and we're witness to that. So that's what gives us perspective on thinking, is the ability to recognize that silence and then come back to it. But also to just notice, as Luang Por teaches very often, has repeated many times, learning to think intentionally, simple things, think simple thoughts, and notice the silence between the words, between the thoughts. So to cultivate these exercises, because once we have had even a small insight into that, we need to cultivate it, remind ourselves. That is the practice. not to just have an insight and then rest contented with that, because then that insight just becomes a memory. But if we cultivate the insight and re-actualize it, remember that clarity, and finding a way to come back to that position from which that clarity is the reality here and now, from which we can see things clearly. So I'd encourage you to be very, very careful of thinking, mistrustful of the thoughts that arise. In schools, primary, secondary, and university, in our studies, and then generally in society, we do tend to value thinking, and it is a very useful tool. But we're not careful enough of it. And we get caught up in our thoughts. We get caught up in believing that the thoughts that arise, the content of the thought is actually true and real. So to be careful of that. It avoids us a lot of useless suffering. And the ability to cultivate that sense of care comes from really intentionally looking at thinking. So not getting rid of it, because if we get rid of it, then it's, well, first of all, we can't, but if we try to get rid of it, then we're basically dismissing our teacher. We need to learn from thinking by watching it and coming back to this knowing thinking is like this. And we learn to step back from it. And when we need to use thinking, when we need to figure something out, plan for the future, we can. And when we're done, then we can put it down. So coming back to that suggestion I made at the beginning of just taking a little moment to review a period of sitting meditation, as we did together at the beginning of this session. Don't be afraid to sit with thinking, with chaos. Don't be afraid to sit with a mess, sitting down and feeling like everything's out of control. Or we can feel confused and restless and ignorant and unenlightened. And we can use that. We can sit down and say, okay, well, it's like this. What would the position of the witness be in a situation like this? And that's when you just sit down with it. And as Long Paul told me many years ago when I was a novice, I was upataking him during one of his visits to Wat Nanachat, and I was still getting used to the climate, to the hot, sticky weather, to the cold in the winter season, cold season, to the food, to the language. It was all still very foreign, and I was feeling like I was suffering quite intensely and just wanting to get away from it. And Paul looked at me and said, Asoko, welcome suffering. And that is the last thing I wanted to do there and then. But the attitude is actually liberating, because most of the time we can't change the way things are. We can influence them some, but we can't change them. And so the way to peace and freedom here and now with whatever it is, and if when we sit down to meditate, we feel restless and tired and confused and busy and chaotic, maybe upset, worried, whatever it is, we can still sit with that. And it can be incredibly beneficial in terms of practice to be able to sit down with that and say, okay, so this is the way it is. Welcome suffering. Welcome chaos. Can I find a way of being a witness to restlessness, to confusion, to anger, to frustration, to exasperation, to worry, to fear? Because then we're using the conditions as they are. We're not asking them to be otherwise. We're not setting unrealistic expectations for ourselves, for others, for the situation that we're in, which we're actually operating from a position where we're accepting it's like this. It is this way, whether I like it or not, this is the way it is. So what is the position of freedom here, of knowing? And then we realize that freedom from suffering, freedom from confusion, from fear, from anger, from worry, is not in getting rid of it, but is in the ability to let it be what it is, to welcome it. And our refuge, here and now, becomes the knowing that it's like this. We become transparent, so to speak. Something's coming at us, and instead of hitting us, we let it go through us. It moves through us. We feel it, but we let it feel this way. And then we're coming from a willingness to allow it to cease, allowing it to arise and allowing it to cease. Allowing sankharas to do what they do, which is to arise and cease. That position is in a position of incredible freedom. We just welcome. And it leaves us in a position where we don't get disturbed easily. We don't get knocked over, bowled over by life every time something arises. And there's a certain inflappability about that. It's like, I can take this. So we practice that equanimity. We practice that ability to receive life as it presents itself to us. We practice it here and now. Whether we're very unenlightened or whether we're just this far from Nibbana and complete liberation, it doesn't matter. We can do this. Whatever life presents us, whatever here and now is made of, we can ask ourselves, what is it? And look at it and go, oh, this is what it is. It's like this. And that's operating from this position of witnessing. It's a sense of presence that's informed by wisdom, by understanding. And if we still lack understanding to really let go of it, and we still feel stuck, well, then we can know that. And we're still willing to experience suffering. We're still willing to tell suffering, welcome. Because we know we're learning something from it. I'd like to offer that as a reflection, and maybe we can have half an hour if people have questions I'd like to ask.
Namayang Dhamma Kataya Satukaram Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodam.
Thank you so much, Tanajan. So we'd now like to open the floor to questions. Everyone's welcome to participate in this questions and answers. If you have a comment or a question for Tanajan, feel free to click on the raise hand button on your Zoom panel. You can find it under reactions or under more. Click on it and we'll invite you to unmute. If you have got a question and you're unable to ask it in person and would like me to read it out for you, feel free to type it in the chat box and I'll help you to read it out to Tanajan. Okay. Whilst we wait for the questions, Tanajan, and listen to your talk today, it seems to me that there is perhaps also a training on patience and endurance when you talk about accepting the way it is, right? Could you please perhaps elaborate a little bit about developing that virtue, that energy of patience and endurance?
Yes. That's a good question. I was actually reflecting on patience earlier this morning and last night, and just what an incredibly important part of the practice that is. Like in English, there's an English, or probably many languages have this saying where patience is the mother of all virtues. And in the Buddha's teachings, their patience is sometimes found in this set of 10 paramis. I remember when I was in Ratanawan with Lumpur Sumido, finding the course of daily life challenging in its own ways and getting frustrated with my ability to just bear with it, really. And I asked Lumpur, how'd you develop patience? And he just looked at me and said, by noticing impatience. And that was all he said, and it really made me laugh. But I took it away and I started using that, and I realized that every time I was approaching the practice from this idea, how do I develop patience? It assumes that I'm operating from a position where I don't have patience, I'm lacking patience, and I need to develop it. And I didn't realize how much wrong view, misunderstanding was involved in that position. That was not the position of the witness. That was the position of perceiving myself as someone who lacked patience and needed to do something in order to develop more. And where Lumpur was coming from was a completely different position. Notice impatience. And that really kind of unlocked that conundrum for me, because as I reflected on that, I realized impatience is a reaction that arises when we experience something we don't like the way it is, and we'd like it to be otherwise, and faster, please, because this is not quick enough. That's impatience. So an impatience is a kind of a mood, a reactivity, a reaction, which gives rise to a certain way of thinking. That's all sankhara. That's all created. And so when I changed and started noticing, oh, okay, so this is what impatience is like. You can feel it in your body, and it usually makes you restless. And you can feel it in the mind. You're just itching to try to get away from something. And so noticing impatience and then noticing what it arises with certain conditions. And then the moment you come back to that position of witnessing, you're not feeding it anymore. You're witnessing it. And because you're not grasping it, then it has opportunity to cease. And what are you left with when you allow impatience to cease? There's your patience that you were looking for all along. It's a little bit like looking for silence. You can't create silence, but if you allow noise to cease, then you realize silence was there all the time. And so with patience, I recommend using this, following this advice that Luang Por gave me, which is to notice the impatience. And once you start noticing impatience and you start getting more, you start recognizing it and then develop skill at recognizing it. It's pretty obvious how useless or unbeneficial it is following impatience. But also you realize impatience is not self, patience is not self. Impatience arises from causes and conditions, and if you can recognize it as something that's arisen and let it be, it'll cease, and you don't identify with it, so you don't start perceiving yourself as someone who's impatient. But then patience as well is not something you can make a self of, and yet there's plenty of it there. When we let go of impatience, patience just becomes the fallback option.
So in the process, Ajahn, one would then develop endurance because of the knowing mind, the patience, and the understanding of watching just that chaos enacting in your mind.
Well, endurance is an interesting word because it can bring up this notion that you just have to grit your teeth and tense up and wait for a situation to pass. And sometimes it is like that. Sometimes we experience certain situations that give rise to such strong reactions inside us. It's very difficult to bear with those reactions. But it's interesting to remember that when we're in a situation that we think we need to endure, it's usually not the situation we need to endure. The situation is what it is, and it does not affect everyone the same way. The situation does give rise to these feelings and these reactions and these emotions. And usually that's what we're trying to get away from. The discomfort, the restlessness, the screaming inside, the thoughts that I can't take this, I can't do this, I just can't. These are all thoughts and reactions that arise inside. And that's usually what we're trying to get away from. And so it does happen that sometimes enduring, when we recognize a certain situation and we realize that if we act or speak on these reactions, it's necessarily going to be unbeneficial to someone, us, others. We're going to end up saying or doing something we regret. And sometimes the only option is to literally just bite your lips and don't say it. And then endurance becomes just that ability to wait until the pressure, the inner pressure passes. But endurance is also doesn't have to necessarily be this kind of teeth gritting, tough it out kind of situation. Endurance can also just be what it describes, whatever the word is you use. You can use endurance, you can use patience, you can use waiting, but it's basically endurance starts referring back to this position of investigating in terms of Dhamma. Okay, so this is a tough one. What's going on here? And then you start noticing, okay, this is a situation, and this is the reaction, this is how it feels. And it's suffering. I don't like it. I'd like this to cease. And so you just kind of realize this is what's happening. And that usually involves having perceived and then reacted to a situation coming from wrong view. coming from a sense of self, of me. I am or I'm not, and I want or I don't want, or I agree or disagree, I like or dislike, approve, disapprove. It's all usually about us identifying with something and then taking a position. And that position is not in harmony with the way it is. There's conflict, there's antagonism, and that's where the suffering arises. So we can be in a situation which is difficult, but informed by this intention to use it for practice. This intention is really important and something we can really learn to trust because it will carry us, and it's very powerful. Trust the intention in a situation like that. That intention that says, okay, something's happening here, which is resulting in suffering. So what's happening, and what is the position from which right view arises? Because in terms of right view, everything belongs. When we look at things from the position of right view, of acceptance, then we're recognizing that things are impermanent. We're recognizing that this won't last. We recognize that these things are conditioned. We can read a situation apart from the reactions that might arise. We might still have these reactions, but this position of the witness, from which we can see things for what they are, allows us to notice the situation and the reactions from this kind of open position of witnessing. And then the reactions may well be there, but we're able to respond if we need to. We can sometimes just let something cease and realize we didn't have to get involved. That is something that you can do because your intention is to seek this position of freedom from which the witnessing, the understanding, comes with wisdom, or developing the wisdom. So endurance is that which allows us to do that. It can be kind of just holding on and waiting for a situation to cease, or it can just be waiting for this situation to change and using it to try to develop wisdom.
Thank you so much, Dhamma, for the answers. We have someone here who would like to ask a question. Number one, Mukherjee, could you unmute yourself? I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Can you unmute?
Yeah, it's Nabarun. Thank you, Vita. Thank you, Ajahn, for the teachings, and so good to see you. My question is relating to something you mentioned, is that relating to the attachment or kind of a tendency to be drawn to the stillness and the tranquility of meditation. For me, I find it like the mind is very calm and still when I'm in meditation. But when I'm off the mat, it's a bit agitated, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the conditions. And I try to be mindful and try to see the situation with wisdom and work with that. But my question is relating to, is there a problem? Is there a tendency to be, when I get free time, I try to meditate or I try to sit on meditation. There's a tendency to that calmness and stillness, and if there's an attachment and if there's a, how should I deal with that? That's your advice that I seek.
Understand that the path is a path to liberation. Like when the Buddha was asked to express his teaching in the simplest terms, he says, what I teach is suffering and the end of suffering. So stillness is not an end in itself. The stillness that we can cultivate is for the sake of seeing clearly. So we use the word stillness in contrast with what is not still, what's moving, what's impermanent, what arises and ceases. So the stillness is the ability to stand on the bank of the river and watch the river flow by. And yet at the same time, when the Buddha talks about his teaching, he teaches suffering and the end of suffering. So we need to understand suffering. Because when we hear that, if the gut reaction is like, oh, I want the end of suffering, how do I get that? But the first part is suffering. And so we need to kind of be able to receive suffering so that we can study it. And in the process, the stillness is as much a position we can come back to get a break from it, because sometimes it's just a bit much. And the ability to just go somewhere and sit quietly and close your eyes and just let it all go. And rest in a state where for a moment it's all nice and quiet is resourcing. But just sitting like that does not give rise to wisdom. And it is something that every practitioner needs to learn how to develop this balance between how much of that do I need to do, and when is that enough, and I come back to meeting suffering. Because the freedom comes from understanding that whatever arises and ceases is impermanent and satisfactory and not self. And the ability to develop that wisdom, that it becomes so present every moment and informs every moment we meet, every time consciousness meets samsara, samsara arises in consciousness and ceases in consciousness. Whatever part of that, excuse me, whatever part of that experience it is, we need to be able to recognize it for what it is. Because if we don't recognize what it is, our habits out of ignorance are to grasp one part or the other of it. So we need to study how we grasp. And we study grasping by grasping and seeing what it does. And so stillness is a very good thing to cultivate. It gives us a break, and it gives us also this perspective from which we can then watch. But you need to pay attention to that willingness. How willing are you to, from that position of stillness, say, okay, I'm ready for the next round, come at me. If you don't find yourself willing to kind of get back into the ring of life and say, yes, life is made of stuff that arises and ceases. And as long as we haven't developed wisdom and completely understood the package, suffering will keep arising. So we need to kind of get back in the mud, so to speak, and muck around until we understand what's happening. Notice how willing you are to do that, and that will give you a measure of whether you're attached to the stillness or if you're developing it, understanding that it gives you the ability to take on some more samsara and try to develop some more wisdom. Was that helpful?
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Tanaja. That was helpful. I understand that the balance needs to be worked out individually and personally. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanajan. Let me move on to a typewritten question here. This is from Priyanka. Priyanka's question is, I found out I cannot sit for a long time, but my mind seemed to be able to direct towards silence, witnessing while walking. It's not focusing on breathing, but just watching around me, the trees, the plants, the people, etc., without thinking on what's going on in the mind. With a silent mind, is this meditation?
Yes, it is. I mean, just the fact that you are taking time to walk up and down, notice the people and the trees and the stuff around you, and notice the silence in the mind. I mean, that itself is already practice. And you probably wouldn't do that if you didn't realize the value of coming back to that sense of silence and spaciousness, where thinking isn't necessarily operating, or if it is, you're not paying attention to it. But then also it's useful when you do that to notice how that affects you. So walking up and down and just watching with a sense of openness in the heart, where you notice silence and spaciousness. So you're noticing that part of the mind experience, and then you're noticing that part of the experience which is made of the things that surround you, the people in the trees. What you could also do is just notice how that affects you, because we do have personal conditioning and tendencies and habits which make different practices appeal to some people more than to others. But generally speaking, what we're also trying to cultivate is the ability to just realize how this experience of a body and a mind affects us, and where do we get caught up in it? And when we do get caught up, how do we develop freedom at that place where we do get caught up? So by all means, if walking meditation works better for you, do a lot of that, because it's very beneficial. But also maybe don't neglect the opportunity to investigate what happens when you do a period of walking and then go back to sitting, and then just watch how sitting affects you. Because awareness and consciousness, understanding and wisdom, they're not dependent on the posture of the body. And the Buddha kind of encourages us to develop mindfulness and understanding in all four postures of the body. And some postures might be more conducive. Some people find sitting more helpful, other people find walking more helpful. Some people find alternating between the two really helpful. But pay attention and notice how a posture or a situation actually affects you, what the reactions are that come up inside. Because sometimes we do find ourselves in certain situations and we think, oh, I can't do this. And it could be that because something's happening that we're not aware of. It's almost like we develop awareness, and then when we make it more subtle, it's like we're lowering the threshold, and some stuff that was, so to speak, subconscious, all of a sudden comes into awareness. And as we develop mindfulness, and we increase the amount of things that we're actually aware of, that we notice consciously, rather than they're just knocking about in the body and the mind without us paying attention to them. And as this kind of sense of awareness expands, then all of a sudden we become conscious of like, oh, okay, so there's this thing happening which I didn't notice before. Or we become all suddenly aware of a type of conditioning that was always there, but we didn't notice. But when we become aware of a certain type of conditioning, then we can see how that conditions certain reactions that arise. And all of a sudden it sheds light on it. And because we can see the conditioning arise and influence thinking and reacting, we can open up and just let it be. But then in that opening up, we have space for it to be what it is without us trying to change it. But there's space around it, which becomes the refuge and where we find freedom. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Tanajan. There is a lady here. Her name is T. She's from Brisbane, and she has a question. T, could you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Hello, Pante. Yes, I'm from Brisbane. Before I ask you a question, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the team behind this for organizing this wonderful Dhamma discussion, so everyone around the world can listen and learn Dhamma. Yeah, and thank you, Pante, for sharing wonderful reflection about our present moment here and now. I have this question in my mind for a long time, but I haven't had a chance to ask anyone yet. So I'm happy that you brought up this reflection again to bring me back to the question. I have been thinking about the people in some part of the Africa where the soldiers brainwashed kids' mind or adult minds. So I wonder, for those people, can they still apply present moment or realize here and now for this kind of practice? Because what I can see is when you practice here and now or stay at the present moment, most of us have lots of concepts where we learned from our society, from our daily life, or we brought up in the culture where lots of concepts turns into the words and stays in our brain for such a long time. So if they brainwash our concepts, will that mindfulness mind, or we say awareness of mind, we would still be there, or they actually brainwash that ability as well? So could you please share your thought with us? Thanks.
We're all brainwashed. What you're talking about is a very, very sad situation, and these things do happen. But that's the gift of Dhamma. The gift of awareness is that awareness doesn't have any boundaries. It doesn't have any limitations. And this consciousness that the Buddha describes as pure, boundless, and without any characteristic, it has only one function, is to know. There's nothing consciousness cannot know. And the reason we call it a practice, and it's a progressive path, it's not like the Buddha's teaching is a path. The path is always here and now, but it's a path of understanding. And we start by understanding small things, which lead to the next and the next, until we develop freedom little by little, until we have complete freedom. And so this ability to know does not have any limitations. And because it's not created, it's what Lumpur keeps referring to as the unborn, the uncreated, the unformed, the unconditioned. You cannot condition awareness, consciousness out of anybody. It's not possible. We can create conditions, and some of those conditions can become overwhelming, which results in brainwashing, or some people experience really difficult things in their childhood, and they become memories that have such a heavy emotional baggage, they're basically traumatic. But regardless of what the characteristics of a condition are, at the end of the day, they always are just that, a condition. And it's the ability we have to kind of recognize a condition as a condition depends on our exposure to the Dhamma, on Parami, on many things. But you can't brainwash consciousness and awareness, and the ability, that purity of consciousness is there no matter what. The ability to recognize sankharas, conditions, is always there. That cannot be washed out of anyone's brain.
Thank you. It's good to hear that, Pante. I'm glad. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Tanajan. There are a few more questions. I'm also wary of time. Do you have another?
Maybe I can take one more question, because there'll be time for me to go and look after Lumpur this morning.
Right. Okay. So let me read out one more question for you, and we can keep the rest of the other questions for an opportunity that we can invite Tanajan again back to this Dhamma Zoom screen to take those questions, okay? So this question here is from Melanie. Melanie's question is, thank you very much, Ajahn. In difficult situations, I feel very scared to stay with my internal chaos. And sometimes the formal practice becomes just a painful thing to do. How can I change or work with this attitude? Thank you.
Yeah, sometimes it is like that. Sometimes you have to take certain issues, certain things that arise in the mind. You have to really learn to treat them with kids' gloves, because there's a very strong reactivity. And sometimes we don't even understand what that reactivity is. We just experience it. And fear is something that can be paralyzing. But it's interesting to kind of notice fear and just learn to allow fear to be what it is. Because in some way, fear is a kind of a protective mechanism. And like Lompo likes to remind us, these bodies are really, they're biological things. And the purpose of the body is procreation and survival. And so in the survival part of that, we have fear and anger as two very powerful emotions that kick in to protect us. Fear to run away from dangers, or anger to face danger or a threat if we need to. And so they're natural energies. They are conditioned, they are created, but they're natural to this realm. And so it's good to learn to allow these emotions to have a role to play in our lives. So then the question becomes, well, how do I make space for a reaction like fear? And so if you recognize what it is that kind of gives rise to this fear, every time the fear arises, just notice, what are the conditions that are present when this fear arises? Because fear is conditioned. It's like anything else. What are the conditions that give rise to fear? And you may have to kind of look at it out of the corner of your eye, so to speak, rather than look at it face on. Because if you look at it face on, it might be too much. So that's probably what's happening when you say that you sit and the chaos in the mind is so scary, is because you're basically sitting down and looking at it face on, and it seems like too much. So you can develop ways of paying attention to it, but just a little bit. Because if you pay just a little bit of attention to it, you may get just a little bit of fear as a reaction to that, rather than too much. And so learning to pace yourself in the practice. So coming back to something I mentioned earlier, trust your intention. I mean, you're here today listening to these reflections on Dhamma, so you're obviously interested in Dhamma, and you obviously trust Dhamma enough to turn to it to find a way out of this suffering. And so that intention is something you can trust. And it's a real boon. It's a real treasure to be able to rely on, because sometimes all you have is that intention. And in a situation like that, you say, I'd like to find a way to be free from this, but I don't know how. And if we pay attention to the I don't know how part of that, we might end up saying, I give up. But if you trust the intention is, I understand this is impermanent. I understand one can be free of it. How does that happen? How do I go about it? Then you're engaging that investigative ability in your mind, that curiosity. And so then that itself testifies to the fact that you don't completely believe in the fear. You're not completely a slave to the fear already, because there's enough space around it to say, okay, guys, how do I deal with this? Trust that. trust that. And from that position, out of the corner of your eye, if you need to, so that it's not too confrontational, so to speak, pay attention, try to figure out what's happening. And the easiest way to do that is to start noticing what are the conditions that are present when this fear starts knocking on the door or tries coming crashing through the door. What does it feel like in the body? Use the body. It's a very safe thing to come back to because it's very tangible. And then notice in terms of thinking, what are the thinking patterns or maybe the memories, or it's a whole picture. Basically the 5 khandhas, right? The body, the feelings of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, memories that arise that cause us to perceive things a certain way, thoughts and emotions, and how we're all experiencing all of that through the 5 senses. So if you can start gently probing and asking questions of the situation, what are the conditions? What gives rise to what? And then you might find that as you kind of start recognizing what's happening, maybe there's one condition which you do have influence over. You can maybe change that so that that is different. And then the fear goes down a notch. And little by little, what you're doing, you're getting to understand the situation better. And as you understand it, you start trusting that, trusting the wisdom and the awareness more than the fear that is arising as a sankhara. And there will be some point where that ratio to how much can I take on? Well, I'm afraid of this one, I don't want to do too much of it. Well, then just do a tiny bit. But look at how you can kind of increase that tiny bit to a little bit more. And then at some point, there will be a shift where you go, oh, yeah, fear. Well, it doesn't matter how strong it is. Now I have some understanding of fear. I realize fear is born from perceptions, memories, and it gives rise to thinking, which tends to make it worse. So if I step back from this and basically coming back to the refuge of awareness, because awareness is aware of fear, is aware of chaos, but awareness is never afraid. It cannot be. Awareness itself is not afraid. Awareness knows fear, knows chaos, and knows they're like this. But the awareness isn't chaotic and isn't afraid.
So on this note, awareness is here and now, as what Luang Por Sumedho would say. It is time for us to thank Thanajan for this very beautiful session of reflections. It is also customary at the start of the rains retreat, the Vassa, that we all ask for forgiveness for Thanajan. As many of us here will be familiar, Thanajan is the secretary to Luang Por Sumedho. Just like what we often would tease him, he is like Ananda to the Buddha. The pearls of wisdom that spouts up from his tongue are so crisp and so direct. It is like commentary listening to the Buddha, to Luang Por Sumedho's deep and profound teachings. But Thanajan has made it so simple, so easy to understand, and helpful for our own practice. So as is with all the Dhamma sessions that we've been doing for the Vassa, we take this opportunity as we ask for forgiveness formally from Thanajan. We will all ask people who can turn on the videos to turn the videos on, and we will perform a asking for forgiveness ceremony from Thanajan.
These brothers and sisters, let us chant together Namo Tassa 3 times first. Call Kaka. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Brothers and sisters, let's bow down and chant together the forgiveness. Maha ere pamadena dwaratayena katang sabbang aparatang kamatuno phante. Maha ere pamadena dwaratayena katang sabbang aparatang kamatuno phante. Maha ere pamadena dwaratayena katang sabbang aparatang kamatuno phante.
Aham kamami tumehipime kemitapang.
Kamama phante.
Icitang patitan tumhang kipame wasaminjatu sapi purentu sankapa canto panaraso yata manicho tiraso yata sapitiyo vivajantu saparoko vinasatu mate bhavatwantarayo sukhitika yuko bhava apivatana silisa niccang buddha pacaino cattaro dhamma vadanti Ayu Wanu Sukang Palang.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
We take this opportunity to wish Tanajan the best of health and hope that he continue to be a guiding inspiration to all of us in this community. And in closing, we'd like to close with verses of sharing and aspiration. May we invite Tanajan to lead us in chanting in English the verses of sharing and aspiration, please.
Do you have a version you can put up on the screen for people to follow? Yeah, nice. Now let us chant the verses of sharing and aspiration. Through the goodness that arises from my practice, may my spiritual teachers and guides of great virtue, my mother, my father, and my relatives, the sun and the moon, and all virtuous leaders of the world, may the highest gods and evil forces, celestial beings, guardian spirits of the earth, and the Lord of death, may those who are friendly, indifferent, or hostile, may all beings receive the blessings of my life. May they soon attain the threefold bliss and realize the deathless. Through the goodness that arises from my practice, and through this act of sharing, may all desires and attachments quickly cease, and all harmful states of mind, until I realize Nibbana in every kind of birth. May I have an upright mind, with mindfulness and wisdom, austerity and vigor. May the forces of delusion not take hold, nor weaken my resolve. The Buddha is my excellent refuge. Unsurpassed is the protection of the Dhamma. The solitary Buddha is my noble guide. The Sangha is my supreme support. Through the supreme power of all these, may darkness and delusion be dispelled.
Thank you, Tanajan. And as we let you go to look after Luang Por Sumedho, with respect and all our sincere love for you, we will all now chant Arahant as we take leave from you. Arahant Sama Sambuddho Bhagava Buddhang Bhagavantang Abhivademi. Swatato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammang Namasami. Supatipano Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho Sanghang Namami.
Thank you very much for having organized this session. And Anumodana to the whole team. I know there's a big crew behind these sessions, so I'd like to thank everybody who's helped. And Anumodana for everyone who has participated and attended. Until next time.
To the next time, Ajahn Asoko will come back.
Okay.